So the first thing to understand is in the Jewish system, God saw their system as very good. Now you have to remember, their system was set up by God himself. So that when you look at the laws and everything that govern Israel, you find them particularly in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. But they're all contained somewhere in the Pentateuch. And they're actually a very good law. You know, we've had opportunities to mention things, but just a couple of them. In the Jewish law, when you plow a field, you may not plow into the corners. You have to round corners on a field when you plow it. And that's in order to make sure there's land preserved for wild birds in the corner of the land. And you're not allowed to plow in there. You're not allowed to do that. If you raise apples, for instance, you need to decide when you're going to harvest apples. And when you decide to harvest apples, you go through your field and harvest apples. You can never go through your field a second time. Once you've harvested the apples that are not ripe, when you're harvesting your apples, are to ripen later for poor people. That's why they aren't ripe. So you pick the ripe apples, okay? Anyone at any time can walk into your field and eat apples. No person can carry an apple out. You carry an apple out, that's stealing. But if you're hungry, their laws are fantastic. And they preserve the land, they take care of the people and everything. The one danger in their system is someone who is not under the law. Widows, orphans, aliens. So, because these are the people that are not governed by this law, these are the people that the community must give the closest attention to. And these are the people the community must guard and make sure they're taken care of. Because everyone else, they presume, is taken care of by the law. I would compare it to something that one of the political candidates said not long ago, that I don't care about the very rich because they can take care of themselves. I'm really concerned with the middle class. I don't care about the poor. They have all this system to take care of themselves. It's kind of the system that was set up in Israel actually did take care of people. It was very well set up. So the community as a group, with this social justice thing, what you had to do was be careful of anyone who was not really covered by this law. And why are we required to do that in the Jewish scriptures? There is a verse that is woven through many points in the Jewish scriptures that when you actually hear it is a terrifying verse. But it's something I think people really need to understand to know what's going on. And the verse is, you must be holy as your heavenly Father is holy. And the idea is our holiness is tied to our leveling for everyone. This is really what God's about. And we know that God is very interested in social justice because of the law he gave the Jews. So he says, now this covers this, but it's your duty to be holy like I am holy with these people who are not covered by the law. So then they are required to do this. And the very purpose of the law is so that people will become as holy as God. You know, that sounds kind of like a terrifying thing, but we see a very similar thing once we get into the Christian scriptures. It comes from Paul, but I think you know we use it in the liturgy of the Eucharist. When water is poured into the wine, it says, may we come to share in the divinity of God as Christ came to share in our humanity. And one of the basic Pauline concepts is that Jesus became a human being so that you and I could learn how to become divine. I don't like to use the word gods, but that's basically the word he uses, okay? So that you and I can become divine. And when we look at the life of Jesus, now moving into the Christian scriptures, we look at the life of Jesus, we notice the same types of things, except that the world has really changed. In the days of Jesus, the Jewish law is not what dominates, it's the Roman law. And so while the Jews would try and follow their law, you have to remember they're a Roman province. And so you must live under the Roman law. The Roman law was a very, very different thing. And so what they are called to do, because under the Jewish law, you can understand what it is to be divine by following the law. Under the Roman law, you can only figure out what it is to be divine by watching Jesus, because Jesus is God living under that. And there are a lot of things we watch with regards to Jesus as he moves through his life. His most particular concern, if we put it into one word, is the poor. And in Jewish terms, it's difficult to translate the word poor into English. The closest word that we could translate is the word dependent. The word poor really doesn't have a lot to do with money. And I'll tell you where the word poor comes from in the Jewish tradition. When an invasion would come, like the Babylonians, first of all, would, when they came into an area, would kill all the people involved in government. It's proof they weren't all bad. But anyway, they eliminated all the people who were involved in government. Once those people were dead, the next thing they did was kill soldiers. And then if you were an adult male who would be useful as a slave, you would be enslaved. If you were an adult male who was dangerous, like for instance the soldiers and stuff, you'd be eliminated. If you were an adult female who would be useful as a slave, they would take you as a slave. And if you were a person who would be, dangerous to them, if you're a rabble-rouser or something, they would kill you too. If you were a child, let's say 8 and under, but could basically survive, they would actually adopt you into their families and you would be raised as though you had never been a Jew at all. And if you're too young really to survive that trip, small babies, they were left behind. And if you were too elderly really to survive, you were left behind, just abandoned. And if any of you saw the movie The Mission, you remember that when they went through the Indian village. The babies were just put in a huge pile. The elderly were abandoned in their homes there. The rest were either killed or taken as prisoners. Okay? Well, that's exactly what happened in the history of Israel. But the curious thing in the history of Israel? God always raised up his people from those worthless elderly people and dead, dying babies they left behind. That's always where God raised his people. So the word Anawim refers to people who are worthless. The Anawim is the baby, they cannot survive, and the elderly person who really can't carry on. If you watch through Scripture, you'll watch the word Anawim applied to many people who end up catastrophically important. And do you know the Magnificat where Mary says that God has looked upon the lowliness of his servant? He has looked upon the Anawim of Mary. If you look at someone like Ruth, she will talk about the Anawim of Ruth. If you look at Esther, the Anawim of Esther. There's just a tremendous number of these people through Scripture who, are really too old or too helpless or too... So they apply the word Anawim to them. But once you apply the word Anawim to them, God seems to work powerfully through the Anawim. And so the community is really tied to these Anawim. And that's what we're called to do as Christians. Jesus focused his social justice on what they would call Anawim, these people who are helpless with one way or another. And a couple of things about Jesus in helping people. One of the things that we notice, and this is particularly true with, like the woman taken in adultery or something like that, where it's kind of an obvious question. We have lots of questions when we look at the thing of the woman taken in adultery. Where exactly is the person who found her in adultery? What happened to the man who was supposed to be committing adultery? We have a whole bunch of questions. The wonderful thing about Jesus, he never asks those questions. Jesus is never concerned how a person gets in the situation they're in. Flat out, that is not an issue. And Jesus is very careful that he never embarrasses or does anything like that with regards to an issue. If this person is poor and in need, it doesn't really matter whether they put it all into lottery tickets or whatever. If this person is poor and in need, then they're taken care of. And so that's one of the major things to notice about Jesus with this whole business of social justice. That Jesus avoids any questions about how you got there, okay? And just goes on with that. I'm always reminded of I think a very good example of compassion in San Luis Obispo is this. There's a community there that deals with weight issues, and everyone who's been there has dealt with the weight. No one asks the question about how you gained the weight. That question is not asked of anyone. You wouldn't even think to ask it, because every one of us has been there. We know how it happens, No one mentions it. And I oftentimes think that's the compassion element in this whole thing of social justice, is the compassion element. Another thing that I think is very important in social justice is to be able to identify actions of social justice. And I'm going to give you an example in a couple of minutes, but almost everyone is involved in some mode of social justice. Almost everyone, no matter who you meet, is involved in some action of social justice. And most people do not know that it is social justice. They will see it as a kindness, a compassion, whatever. They just get involved in it, but they do not understand it as an act of social justice. And I think one of the major things is to be able to identify acts of social justice, to be able to reward acts of social justice, encourage acts of social justice, and publicize acts of social justice. People need to know what's being done. I think there is much more mileage in publishing a story about something that is being done in social justice than there is in publishing a story about the need for social justice. I think much more can be gotten out of showing what actually happens. And I think, personally, once one has honestly experienced social justice, a person will be hooked. We mentioned before that the reason why God allows things in our lives, the reason why God does things, is not because of anything God gets out of it. God doesn't need anything. Anything you and I go through is actually for our benefit. But I'll tell you a story now. It's a story you all know because it was on TV about 3 years ago. But I'd like to look at it simply from social justice. It's a football story. And there was a high school. And I forget where the high school was, but if I remember correctly, it was in the area of Wisconsin. And they had a boy on the team who was mildly retarded, and suffered some physical difficulties as a result of it. And he always wanted to be a football player. So for 4 years of high school, he suited up at every game, and he sat on the bench, and he was very excited and very happy to do that. It was a big deal to him that he was actually a member of the football team. And what his coach decided was on the last game, they were going to put him into the game, and all the guys on the team knew it. But there was a condition for that to happen. And the condition was he had to talk to the coach of the other team, because this guy could be very seriously hurt by tackling or anything. In fact, from the way they described the boy, if someone from the opposing team had asked for the ball, he'd have handed it to them. So, they had to let the other team know that the other team was going to tackle him and make sure he didn't get hurt in the process or anything. So that was all set up. And then they began the game went on, and finally they called the guy up into the game, and you cannot imagine the guy's face when he realized he was actually called into the game. And unannounced to their team, the other team had decided that this kid was going to make a touchdown and that they would stay behind the kid as he went to the thing. So, this occurred, and the kid made the touchdown, and the camera focused on the kid. It is indescribable, his joy. The camera pulled back, and all the team members on both teams were crying. And they pulled back to the stands, and everyone was just, in tears. That's social justice. That little boy could not have done that simply because life put him in an unfair position. So what happened? So that group of people got together and leveled the playing field. It was a simple act of social justice. I wish TV had covered how often that happened in other schools after that. Once that was seen on TV, there is not a single person in that stadium at that time who knew they had participated in social justice. But that's what that is. And that's also what happens when you really are involved in social justice. Why? Because when you're involved in social justice, you become like God. And what you feel at that moment is actually what God feels. That's what God does for a living. God takes care of people who need him. And he loves doing it. Any person who does it comes to the experience of the power of what it is to be like God. You must be like God. And in being like God, you experience what God experiences in being God. And that becomes the thing that gets social justice. So often when we think of social justice, it's a matter of pointing out all these needs. You'll never run out of the needs, or this sort of thing. But the idea is to find something someone enjoys, get them involved in it. Once you actually experience social justice, I would be willing to bet that those men on the field, I would be willing to bet that is an absolute life-changing event that they will not have equaled any time before or after in their life. It will change the way each of those kids lives their entire life, and simply because of a powerful experience of this social justice and the accomplishment of the social justice. God's gifts are the things that enable us to change another person's life for the better. And that's why we get those gifts. Those gifts, to be exercised that way, is the only way you realize what that gift is. Every one of us here has gifts, specific gifts that make us different and better than everyone else in this room. It's just that they're all different for all at once. But they're all different gifts in which you and I, we could pick any person in this room and go through their gifts and find the gift that separates them from the rest of us. We could do this with every person. But you realize that gift is the particular gift that allows you to experience what it is to be God. And that is the particular gift that God has given you to actually help others. And that's the reason you got that gift. You got that gift so that you could actually help others, and in that way become like God. Jesus came among us so that you and I could one day be empowered to live with God. That's what we're supposed to do for all eternity. That you and I are supposed to live in a divine family for all eternity. If you want to live in the family, you have to learn what it is to be divine. And the way you learn what it is to be divine is through this exercise of the social justice and using your gift, your power. People who don't do that, people who use their power for other things, actually never on the face of the earth experience divinity. You have the power to experience divinity. And there are many people who walk the face of the earth and never experience it. And it's little wonder they don't see a value, to everlasting life. They don't see beliefs. They have never actually experienced divinity. I'd also tell you that once you set on that path, and one of the greatest things you can do is read the lives of saints. But you look at where Mother Teresa ended up. I've mentioned to you before that interview that was being done with her. There was a young man from the BBC who was interviewing her, and she didn't have time to stop her work to go for the interview. So he interviewed her while she was bathing lepers. And when the interview was over, but the microphone was not off, he turned to her aside and said, I wouldn't do that for $1 million. And her response is, neither would I. The fact is, she had experienced at some point, she had experienced the social justice high. And when she experienced that, she spent the rest of her life seeking it. And that's what she did. And you know, who wouldn't do anything to experience divinity? I mean, what's $1 million besides experiencing divinity? And that's what she did. And that's what we're invited to do in that way. Another thing is that when we cannot get people involved in social justice, when people are not interested and not, you know, I think we have to learn to look at those people with sympathy rather than anger or judgment. It's really sad that someone will go through life and never experience that. It's a real tragedy that they would go through life and never experience it, much more than a production of anger. Like, I wonder how many coaches watching that game were sitting there thinking, why didn't I ever do that with my team? You know? Why didn't I ever do that with my team? And how many coaches have the chance to do that? Now, I bet a huge number of coaches have done it one way or another since. But that's why it's very important to advertise social justice, okay? That when social justice is done and this sort of thing, you know, is accomplished, it becomes something very, very powerful. And when you think about it, like I remember after the game, I was thinking about to myself, what actually had the teams done? Do you know that the key to doing what they did was that they did nothing? That was the thing, the key, you know? The key was to hand him the ball and get out of his way. Do nothing. That's how it's accomplished. There are all kinds of very simple ways to accomplish social justice. But the key is to get someone to do it once. You know, once you taste divinity, you'll never settle for anything else the rest of your life. That you'll always seek that in everything you're about. And I oftentimes look at the life of Jesus. When you watch in the scriptures, it's funny that when we study today, so often we study the teachings of Scripture. I've expressed this to you before. I have an allergy to red letter editions of the Bible. But we really, you know, get stuck in this idea of the words of Jesus. Do you know that when you read through the Scriptures, not a single person who listened to the teachings of Jesus shows up in the Acts of the Apostles? It's the people who lived with him, the people who wandered around with him, the people who experienced Jesus. It is the experience of Jesus that brought these people into the understanding of what was it. You know, you could say, as Jesus often did, you're supposed to forgive one another. Okay, sounds good. You know, we all agree it's his teaching and all that sort of thing. But interestingly, the people who became the leaders of the church and the powerful people in the scriptures are the people who were with him when he forgave someone. Once you saw the experience of Jesus in forgiving a person, and you know, you think about it for a minute, I talked about, you know, the power each one of us has over everyone else. You know, the power Jesus had over everyone else was he could forgive sin. That was his power over everyone else. No one else could do that. If I came in front of Jesus, perfectly qualified for hell, perfectly set up for hell, Jesus had the ability to say, you're going to heaven. Like that. And you know, he did it. I don't care who you are. You came up to him. That's exactly what he did. That was his gift. If you got close to him, you got it. Period. That would be the great thing of all of us. If the gift is, whatever the gift is, and again, I think you need to find it by what you really enjoy doing that. But when you find that gift, the ability to offer it basically to everyone. Anyone who gets close enough to get it should get it. You know, whatever the gift is, anyone who gets close enough to receive it should in fact receive it. And that basically is the social justice model. I think it's one of the interesting things when you begin to look at history and stuff, the times when social justice is denied, and then the price someone pays for it, and when social justice is granted, and the rewards that come with it. I just take one example. I'll take a person. I'll take Albert Einstein. You know, Albert Einstein came to the United States because he was denied social justice in Germany. Germany was slowly sinking into the whole Nazi morass. And for that, you know, that he was set aside and all this sort of thing. And it was an act of social justice that we were able to provide a way for him to get to this country and this sort of thing. But do you know what he brought to this country? Helped us actually win that war when the whole thing was over. And had Germany been as welcoming to Einstein as we were, you and I would probably be flying Nazi flags today. They would have won the wars. It was very simple that what he brought with regards to technology and everything to the United States. And that isn't what anyone was about. What were we about? At that time, we were about trying to rescue this person who had so much to offer and stuff. And so we went about rescuing. That's one of the things of social justice. Social justice, as I mentioned, is always more a benefit to the person who practices social justice than the person we're about, you know, giving the social justice to or working the social justice for. So basically, that was the material I wanted to present today. The particular thing to do, and I'd encourage you to take some time and kind of think about it, that think about, you know, that game as I gave you under a model of social justice. And once you think about that in a model of social justice, look in your own background and in your life where you've had experiences like that, where they've had this powerful sense of what you've done, and look at it very carefully. I would suspect you will inevitably find it's an instance of social justice. It's an instance where you had a power to grant something for someone who did not have the power to do it. And in granting it, you come to that experience. And again, Thomas Merton describes that as the divine experience. He says, you enjoy what God enjoys about being God. You enjoy what God enjoys about being God through the exercise of social justice. Okay?